2 jobs, 1 question. Have you ever stood in front of the mirror early in the morning, eyes burning from lack of sleep, and quietly asked yourself, what am I even trying so hard for? 2 weeks ago, I asked myself that exact question. Not in a dramatic movie moment, but in a very ordinary one, tying my shoes, getting ready for my first job of the day, while the clock in the United States barely showed 5 a.m. This video is not about quick success. It is not about a shiny American dream. It is about effort. And one small but haunting question, do you respect effort? More importantly, do you respect your own? I came to the US with English that was good enough to read signs and order coffee. But when you start working 2 jobs in one day, you realize English is not just a language. It is energy. It is confidence. It is the ability to stand upright and say, I'm trying, even when your voice feels weak. During the first days of those 2 weeks, I almost gave up. Not on work, but on learning English. That sounds strange, right? Being in America, and wanting to quit English. But your brain is strange when you're exhausted. When you're tired. It doesn't care about long-term goals. It only cares about survival. And English, on those days, felt like something extra, something my brain decided could wait. In the morning, I worked an early shift. In the evening, I worked a late one. Between them, there were about 3 empty hours. 3 hours most people would use to sleep, or at least breathe. I put on my headphones, played slow English audio, and tried not to fall asleep at the table. Sometimes I listened and understood nothing. Not because the words were hard, but because my mind was empty. Maybe you've been there too. You listen to English, but the sounds pass through you like water. You nod, but nothing stays. And then you blame yourself. I'm just bad at this. The truth is, you're not bad. You're tired. Psychology calls this cognitive overload, when your brain is handling too much at once: work, weather, a new culture, money pressure, and quiet loneliness. In that state, your brain prioritizes survival, not learning. So when you can't focus on listening or speaking English, it's not a personal failure. It's a very human biological response. Knowing the reason doesn't make it easier, though. One night after my second job, I sat in my car, phone still in my hand, and asked myself, why am I learning English if I barely have the energy to talk at all? That question wasn't small. It hit my self-respect. In America, people talk a lot about hard work. But no one tells you what hard work feels like when your English is not strong yet. When you want to say something kind, but have to simplify it until it sounds childish. When you understand people speaking fast, but your response comes 1 beat too late. Just 1 beat, but enough to make you feel smaller. That's when I realized something uncomfortable. I was not respecting my own effort. I expected myself to work 2 jobs, speak fluent English, stay motivated, and never feel tired. That wasn't discipline. That was self-punishment. So I changed one very small thing. I stopped aiming to be good at English. My only goal became this: stay with English every day, even for just 10 minutes. 10 minutes of slow listening. 10 minutes of reading a short paragraph. 10 minutes of whispering to myself in the car. Today was hard, but I showed up. It sounds silly, but your brain loves small goals. When you complete them, your brain releases dopamine, the chemical that makes you feel okay. And that okay feeling is the foundation of real, sustainable motivation, not loud promises or big speeches. During those 2 weeks of working 2 jobs, I didn't suddenly become fluent. But I stopped hating English. And that was a quiet victory. I began to catch simple sentences at work. I started answering, even when my words were basic. Most importantly, I stopped treating exhaustion as proof of failure. If you're here, watching this video, there's a good chance you've asked yourself the same thing. Is all this effort worth it? I don't have a perfect answer. But I know this: effort does not need anyone else's approval to have value. It only loses meaning when you stop respecting it yourself. And maybe, just maybe, that is where your English journey, and mine, truly begins. 2. Arrival shock in America. No one really tells you that the biggest shock, when you arrive in America, is not the English. It's everything happening at the same time. The climate, the pace, the light, the noise, the way people walk as if they're always late for an invisible appointment. You step off the plane, your body still confused by the time zone, and your brain is already forced to survive in a completely new system. In that state, listening, reading, and speaking English becomes a quiet, but exhausting challenge. I arrived in the US right when the weather started to shift. Mornings were cold enough to stiffen my fingers. Midday was suddenly bright and warm. Evenings came with sharp wind cutting through my jacket. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I felt tired without knowing why. I slept enough, yet I woke up heavy. Science calls this climate adaptation stress. When your body spends extra energy adjusting to a new environment, leaving very little mental space for learning. Then came culture. In America, everything moves with its own rhythm. People speak fast. They walk fast. They decide fast. Not because they don't care, but because the system is built for efficiency. When you're new, though, you feel half a beat behind. Slow to respond. Slow to answer. Slow to understand what's really being said. You hear a simple sentence, "How's it going?" And suddenly, your brain panics. Is this a real question, or just politeness? Do I answer short, or long? Should I ask back? In those few seconds, your body tightens. Your heart rate rises just a little. That's a normal social stress response. And when stress shows up, your ability to process a second language drops sharply. Not because you don't know the words, but because your brain is prioritizing safety. In the first days, I noticed something uncomfortable. I was hearing English more than ever, but understanding less than ever. Classroom English is clean and slow. Real-life English swallows sounds, connects words, laughs in the middle of sentences, and never waits for you to be ready. My brain had to guess constantly. And guessing all day is exhausting. One morning, I stood at a bus stop. Cold wind burned my ears. Around me were conversations, engines, announcements, all in English. I recognized individual words, but I couldn't connect them into full meaning. It felt like watching a familiar movie, without subtitles. That's when a dangerous thought appeared. Maybe I'm not ready to learn English right now. That thought is very common. It sounds reasonable. But in reality, it's a self-protection mechanism. When the brain is overloaded, it tries to drop energy-heavy tasks, and language learning is one of the most demanding ones. Research on bilingualism shows something interesting. In the early stages of living in a new language environment, learners often experience temporary regression. You may speak worse than before. You may listen slower than before. Even if you studied for years. This does not mean you're going backward. It means your brain is rebuilding itself to match real life. Once I understood that, I stopped blaming myself. I changed my approach. Instead of trying to understand everything, I started choosing. I listened more slowly. I accepted missing details. I stopped trying to catch every word and focused only on the main idea. Your brain prefers that. It's like telling it, it's okay. We don't need perfection. I also began observing American culture with my eyes, not just my ears. How people line up. How they keep personal space. How they say sorry quickly, without much emotion. Those observations helped me guess meaning when listening. Language doesn't live alone. It lives inside behavior. Here's something surprising. When I became less tense about English, I actually understood more. Not because people spoke slower, but because my brain was no longer in alarm mode. When you're less afraid of mistakes, your ears open. When you stop judging yourself, your memory works better. Many learners think motivation disappears because they are weak. But often, motivation disappears because the nervous system is overwhelmed. The brain doesn't quit English because it hates learning. It pauses because it's tired of fighting too many battles at once. If you're in America right now, or if you're learning English through real-life stories, remember this. The initial shock is not a sign you don't belong. It's a sign you've actually entered a new environment. Every new environment comes with confusion. Don't use those confusing early days to judge your ability. Use them to adjust to the climate, to the culture, to how your brain reacts when it leaves its comfort zone. Because once you accept that this discomfort is normal, it stops being your enemy. And when that happens, English, even if it stays slow, begins to stay with you longer. Arrival shock in America. No one really prepares you for the kind of shock that hits when you arrive in America. People warn you about the language, the accent, maybe the food. But the real shock is not English itself. It is everything changing at once. The climate changes first. Your body feels it before your mind does. I arrived during a seasonal shift. Early mornings were cold enough to make my fingers stiff. By noon, the sun felt sharp and unforgiving. At night, the wind slipped through my jacket like it had permission. My body was constantly adjusting, burning energy just to stay balanced. I didn't feel sick, but I didn't feel right either. I was tired in a quiet, confusing way. There is a scientific reason for this. When your body enters a new climate, it goes through what researchers call environmental adaptation stress. Your nervous system works harder to regulate temperature, sleep, and alertness. That extra effort leaves less mental energy for learning. So when you sit down to listen to English, and your brain feels foggy, it's not because you're lazy. It's because your system is already busy surviving. Then comes the pace of life. In America, people move quickly, not in a rushed or angry way, but with purpose. They walk as if time is a resource they must protect. Conversations are efficient. Instructions are short. Silence is not always comfortable. When you're new, this rhythm feels overwhelming. You're not slow, you're out of sync. I noticed it in small moments. Someone would ask, "How's it going?" My brain would freeze. Is this a real question, or just politeness? Do I answer honestly or briefly? If I answer, should I ask back? All of this happens in seconds. During those seconds, your body reacts. Your shoulders tighten. Your breathing changes. That's social stress, and it's incredibly common when using a second language in a new culture. Stress doesn't just affect emotions. It directly affects language processing. When stress hormones rise, your brain shifts attention away from complex tasks, like understanding fast speech in a foreign language. That's why, during my first days, something strange happened. I was surrounded by English all the time, yet I understood less than before. Back home, I could listen to English lessons calmly. In America, real-life English came at me with background noise, unfinished sentences, jokes I didn't catch, and people who didn't slow down. My brain was constantly guessing. And guessing all day is exhausting. One morning, I stood at a bus stop before sunrise. The air was cold, my breath visible. Around me were conversations, engine starting, announcements from a speaker. Everything was in English. I recognized words, individual pieces, but I couldn't connect them into meaning. It felt like watching a familiar movie, with the sound slightly distorted. You know it should make sense. But it doesn't. That's when a dangerous thought appeared. Maybe I should pause learning English for now. This thought feels logical. When life is hard, cutting one responsibility seems smart. But this is actually a self-protection response from the brain. When overloaded, the brain tries to drop tasks that consume energy. Language learning is one of the most demanding tasks there is. Studies on second language immersion show a phenomenon called temporary regression. When learners enter a real-life environment, their performance often gets worse before it gets better. Listening feels harder. Speaking feels slower. Confidence drops. This doesn't mean you're losing skill. It means your brain is rebuilding its language system to match reality, not textbooks. Once I understood this, I stopped panicking. I stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "What does my brain need right now?" The answer was simple: less pressure, more safety. I changed how I listened. I stopped trying to understand everything. I focused on key words, tone, and context. I allowed sentences to pass without chasing them. This reduces cognitive load, giving the brain space to recover. Learning doesn't stop when you miss details. Sometimes it improves. I also started watching people, not just listening to them. I noticed how Americans use their bodies when they speak. A quick nod. A brief smile. A step back to create space. These non-verbal signals carry meaning. When you combine them with partial language understanding, comprehension increases. Language lives inside behavior, not just sound. Something unexpected happened. As I became less tense, I started understanding more. Not because people spoke more clearly, but because my nervous system was calmer. When you're not in fight or flight mode, your brain processes language more efficiently. Memory improves. Patterns become visible. Many learners think they lack discipline or motivation. But often, what they lack is regulation. The nervous system is overwhelmed, and motivation disappears as a result. This is not a character flaw. It's biology. If you are in America right now, or if you're learning English through real-life stories, remember this: the initial shock is not proof that you don't belong. It is proof that you have entered a real environment, not a controlled classroom. Don't use these early days to judge yourself. Use them to adjust. Adjust to the climate. Adjust to the culture. Adjust to how your brain reacts when comfort disappears. Because when you stop fighting the discomfort, it stops fighting you back. And that's when English, even if it remains slow, begins to settle in, quietly and steadily. Working nights, learning days. People like to say that time is something you find. But when you're working 2 jobs, you learn a different truth. Time is something you steal quietly. In small pieces, without making a sound. That was my reality during those 2 weeks in America, nights filled with work, days stretched thin, and English squeezed into the cracks. My first job started early. Too early for the sun, too early for motivation. The alarm went off while my body was still arguing with the bed. I moved on autopilot, shower, clothes, coffee, out the door. English was already there waiting. On signs. On schedules. In quick greetings that sounded friendly, but demanded energy I hadn't fully loaded yet. By the time my first shift ended, my brain felt like a phone at 20% battery. Not dead. Just cautious. This was the moment most people would shut down mentally. Scroll. Sleep. Zone out. I used to do that too. But with a second job coming later, I knew something strange. If I didn't touch English during the day, even lightly, I wouldn't have the strength to face it at night. So I made a quiet deal with myself. I wouldn't study. I would exist in English for a few minutes at a time. I sat in my car between jobs and listened to slow audio. Not lessons with pressure. Just voices telling simple stories. Sometimes I understood. Sometimes I didn't. When my eyes closed by accident, I didn't panic. I let the sound continue, trusting that my brain was still doing something in the background. Neuroscience supports this more than people realize. When you listen passively, especially in a tired state, your brain still maps rhythm, intonation, and familiar patterns. It's called implicit learning. You're not memorizing. You're absorbing. And absorption doesn't require force, it requires presence. The second job was harder. Not always physically, but mentally. My English had to work when I didn't want to. Short instructions. Fast questions. Casual jokes I half caught, half missed. Every interaction felt like lifting a small weight. 1 lift is fine. 50 lifts feel heavy. There were moments when I wanted to stop trying. When someone spoke too fast and I just nodded, hoping that was enough. Nodding is a universal language of survival. But each time I nodded without understanding, something inside me tightened. Not because I failed, but because I withdrew effort. That's when I noticed a pattern. On days when I completely avoided English between jobs, the night felt unbearable. Everything sounded louder, faster, more hostile. But on days when I spent even 10 minutes listening or reading something simple, the night felt softer. Still hard, but manageable. This isn't motivation magic. It's regulation. When your brain touches a familiar pattern earlier in the day, it reacts with less alarm later. It's like walking into a dark room you've Already seen once. You're still careful, but you're not blind. I started reading short texts too. Not articles. Not news. Just paragraphs. Sometimes I read the same paragraph 3 times. Not to remember every word, but to let the structure settle. Subject. Verb. Feeling. Meaning. That's enough. Fluency doesn't come from speed first. It comes from stability. One afternoon, while eating a late lunch in silence, I read a sentence that felt oddly comforting. You don't have to do everything today. It wasn't written for language learners, but it landed exactly where it needed to. I whispered it out loud. Slowly. Awkwardly. And for the first time that week, speaking English didn't feel like work. It felt like breathing with intention. At night, after the second job, I didn't practice. I reflected. In English, but gently. I told myself one sentence about the day. Just one. Today was hard, but I stayed. Or, I didn't understand everything, but I understood. Enough. This kind of self-talk matters. The brain listens to tone more than grammar. Psychologists call this self-directed language. When you speak kindly to yourself in a second language, you reduce anxiety associated with that language. Over time, English stops being a test and starts being a tool, even for comfort. Working nights while learning during the day changed my relationship with effort. I stopped seeing effort as something dramatic. Effort became quiet, consistent, almost invisible. No one applauds 10 minutes of listening in a car. No one celebrates reading a paragraph twice. But these small acts built something solid under the surface. By the end of the second week, my life hadn't slowed down. I was still tired. Still busy. Still imperfect in English. But something shifted. I didn't dread hearing English anymore. I expected it. An expectation, unlike fear, doesn't drain energy. If you're balancing work, family, and learning English. Here's the truth no one says clearly enough. You don't need more discipline. You need less resistance. Stop fighting your schedule. Stop waiting for perfect conditions. Touch English lightly. Often. Let it sit next to your life, not on top of it. Because when you work nights and learn during the day, you're not failing at language. You're teaching it where it belongs, inside a real, tired, honest life. Climate and body fatigue. Most people think fatigue comes from work. Long hours. Heavy tasks. Standing too much. Lifting too often. But when you move to a new country, especially a place as large and varied as the United States, fatigue often comes from somewhere quieter. It comes from the climate, and how your body argues with it every single day. During those 2 weeks, I noticed something strange. Some days, my jobs weren't harder than usual, yet my body felt heavier. My thoughts moved slower. English felt further away, like it was standing on the other side of a foggy window. I wasn't sick. I wasn't injured. I was simply drained. And it took me a while to understand why. The American climate is not gentle when you first arrive. Even within one region, the temperature can swing dramatically in a single day. Cold mornings, bright, dry afternoons, windy evenings. Your body constantly adjusts, blood vessels tightening, muscles reacting, energy shifting. This process costs energy. A lot more than you think. Physiologists explain this through thermoregulation. Your body works to keep its internal temperature stable, even when the environment changes quickly. When this system is under pressure, your brain receives fewer resources. The result is subtle but powerful: slower thinking, reduced focus, and emotional sensitivity. Language learning, which already requires concentration, becomes harder without any obvious reason. I felt this most clearly in the mornings. I would wake up stiff, even after enough sleep. My mouth felt dry. My head felt full, but not with thoughts, more like static. Listening to English audio during those moments felt frustrating. I could hear the sounds, but meaning arrived late, if at all. It wasn't until later in the day that I realized my body was still waking up to the climate. Humidity, or the lack of it, played a role too. In drier air, your throat dries out faster. Speaking feels more effortful. Your voice tires quickly. This matters more than people realize. When speaking feels physically uncomfortable, the brain associates the language with discomfort. Over time, that association can quietly reduce motivation. I noticed that on colder days, my pronunciation worsened. Not because my English got worse, but because my jaw and facial muscles were tense. Cold tightens muscles. Tension reduces articulation. Suddenly, words you know well feel awkward in your mouth. You hesitate. You shorten sentences. You speak less. This is not a confidence problem. It's a body problem. Once I understood this, I stopped blaming my mind for what my body was experiencing. Instead, I adjusted small things. I drank more water, even when I wasn't thirsty. Dehydration hides behind fatigue. I warmed my hands before listening or speaking. Warmth signals safety to the nervous system. I slowed down my speech intentionally, giving my muscles time to cooperate. These changes sound simple, almost too simple. But the nervous system responds strongly to physical cues. When your body feels supported, your brain becomes more generous. Language flows more easily when muscles aren't fighting the environment. There was one evening after my second job, when the temperature dropped suddenly. I sat in my car, exhausted. staring at the dashboard. Normally, I would have skipped English completely. But instead, I wrapped myself in my jacket, took a few slow breaths, and listened to a calm English voice for 5 minutes. Just 5. Not to learn. To stay connected. Something important happened in that moment. I realized I didn't need energy to learn English. I needed permission to be tired. Once I gave myself that permission, resistance softened. Psychology calls this self-compassion under stress. When you acknowledge physical limits instead of fighting them, cognitive performance improves. The brain stops wasting energy on self-criticism and redirects it toward processing information, including language. Climate also affects mood. Less sunlight in the morning can lower serotonin levels. Wind and pressure changes can increase irritability. These shifts are subtle, but they shape how patient you are with yourself. And patience is essential when learning a language slowly. I started timing my English practice differently. Instead of forcing it when my body was cold or tense, I waited for moments of physical ease, after a warm drink, after stretching, after walking briefly. Learning didn't take longer. It felt lighter. Many language learners think discipline means pushing through discomfort. But there is a difference between productive effort and physiological resistance. When your body resists, pushing harder doesn't build strength. It builds avoidance. If you're learning English in a new climate, pay attention to your body. Notice when your focus drops. Notice when your voice feels strained. These are not signs of weakness. They are signals asking for adjustment. Language lives in the body as much as in the mind. Your breath shapes your rhythm. Your muscles shape your sound. Your comfort shapes your willingness to speak. By respecting the climate and listening to your body, I didn't become more disciplined. I became more sustainable. And sustainability, not force, is what carries learning forward through long days and tired weeks. Because when your body feels allowed to adapt, your English adapts with it, quietly, patiently, and without asking for heroics. Language at work. People often imagine that learning English at work means having deep conversations, long explanations, or polite exchanges where everyone waits patiently for you to finish your sentence. That image is comforting and completely unrealistic. Real workplace English is fast, fragmented, and unforgiving in small ways. It doesn't pause to teach you. It simply keeps moving. During those 2 weeks, I learned more English at work than I ever did from books. Not because I studied harder, but because the language had consequences. If I misunderstood, something went wrong. If I understood just enough, the day moved forward. That pressure changed how my brain listened. At my jobs, English arrived in short bursts. Commands, questions, comments thrown over a shoulder. No context. No warm-up. Someone would say, "Can you grab that?" and expect movement, not a discussion. Another would ask, "You good?" and the correct answer wasn't grammar, it was speed. At first, this kind of English felt brutal. My brain wanted full sentences, clear structure, and time to translate. But the workplace doesn't offer that. It offers fragments. Tone, body language, and expectation. So my brain had to adapt, quickly. One thing surprised me. Even when I didn't understand every word, I often understood what to do. That's because workplace language is highly contextual. People point. They move. They repeat key words. Your brain fills in gaps using visual and situational clues. This is not cheating. This is how humans naturally learn. Language. Linguists call this situated comprehension. Meaning doesn't live only in words, it lives in action. When someone says, "over there," while already walking, your brain links sound to motion. Over time, that link becomes automatic. You stop translating. You respond. But this only works if you stay mentally present. On days when I was exhausted and emotionally checked out, English felt sharper and more aggressive. The same words sounded harsher. The same tone felt impatient. That's because fatigue lowers emotional regulation. When you're tired, neutral signals feel negative. There were moments when I felt small. When someone repeated a sentence louder, not slower. When jokes passed over my head, and the laughter came half a second too early for me to join. In those moments, it was tempting to withdraw, to speak less, to avoid eye contact, to become invisible. That instinct is understandable. But it's also dangerous for language growth. I noticed that the days I spoke less, my English didn't rest. It shrunk. Not in knowledge, but in access. Words I knew felt harder to reach. Confidence dipped. The next interaction became more stressful. Silence, I learned, is not neutral. It trains avoidance. So I made a rule for myself. Not a big one. Just this, one clear response per interaction. Even if it was simple. Even if it was imperfect. Okay. Got it. I'll try. These phrases became anchors. They kept me engaged. Psychologically, this matters. When you respond verbally, your brain reinforces the idea that English is usable under pressure. Each successful response, no matter how small, builds tolerance. Over time, tolerance becomes comfort. Another thing work taught me was the value of intonation over vocabulary. Many workplace phrases are flexible. All good. You're set. We're fine. The meaning changes with tone. Rising tone invites confirmation. Flat tone closes the topic. Learning to hear this mattered more than memorizing new words. I started listening less to individual sounds and more to melody. Was the sentence falling or rising? Was it sharp or relaxed? This shift reduced mental load. My brain stopped chasing exact meaning and started catching intent. There was one afternoon when a co-worker said something I only half understood. But the tone was calm, the body language open. I answered simply, "Yeah, I can do that." And it was correct. Not grammatically perfect, but functionally right. That moment stayed with me. Because work doesn't reward perfect English. It rewards functional English. Over time, I noticed another change. My listening improved not because people slowed down, but because my brain stopped panicking. Familiar phrases repeated. Patterns emerged. The workplace became a language loop. Predictable. Safe enough. Cognitive science explains this through pattern recognition. The brain loves repetition in context. When phrases repeat in similar situations, understanding becomes automatic. That's why work, despite being stressful, can be one of the most powerful language classrooms, if you stay engaged. But engagement doesn't mean pushing yourself to exhaustion. It means choosing presence over perfection. On hard days, I lowered my expectations. I aimed to understand what mattered. Safety instructions. Task changes. Direct questions. Everything else could wait. This shift saved energy. And saving energy is crucial when you're working two jobs. Language learning doesn't survive on ambition alone. It survives on conservation. By the end of those 2 weeks, English at work no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a tool I could hold, even with tired hands. I still missed things. I still made mistakes. But I stayed inside the language instead of stepping away from it. If you're learning English at work, remember this: you don't need to sound smart. You need to stay responsive. Speak simply. Listen for intent. Let repetition do the heavy lifting. Because real workplace English doesn't ask for perfection. It asks for presence, and rewards you quietly when you give it. Cultural rules you feel first. Before you understand American culture with words, you feel it with your body. You feel it in how close people stand. In how quickly they expect an answer. In how silence is treated not as rest, but as hesitation. Long before I could explain these rules in English, my nervous system had already learned them the hard way. During those 2 weeks of working two jobs, culture showed up not in big conversations, but in small corrections. A glance when I paused too long. A repeated instruction that sounded neutral, but carried pressure. A polite smile that ended a discussion, instead of opening one. None of this was rude. But all of it was information. One of the first cultural rules I felt was time ownership. In the US, time belongs to the task, not the relationship. People are friendly, but efficiency comes first. When someone asks a question, they usually want a short answer. Not your story. Not your explanation. Just the piece of information that moves things forward. At first, this clashed with my instincts. I wanted to explain myself. I wanted to soften answers. I wanted to add context. But every extra sentence felt like friction. I noticed that when I spoke briefly, interactions flowed. When I spoke carefully but slowly, the air tightened. This wasn't about kindness. It was about rhythm. Cultural psychologists talk about low-context communication. In low-context cultures like the US, meaning is carried mostly by words, not by shared background or emotional reading. People expect clarity, not interpretation. When you hesitate, they don't assume thoughtfulness. They assume uncertainty. Feeling this difference was uncomfortable. Especially when English wasn't flowing easily. Silence, which in some cultures means respect, here felt like absence. The longer I stayed silent, the more pressure I felt to perform. Another rule I felt deeply was respect for effort over status. In many places, respect comes from age, position, or education. In the US workplace, respect often comes from showing up and doing the job consistently. People noticed effort. Even when English was broken. There were days when my sentences were simple, my grammar imperfect, my accent heavy. But I was on time. I stayed focused. I tried again when I failed. And that mattered. I could feel it in how people spoke to me, more directly, more comfortably. This changed something important in my head. I stopped trying to sound impressive. I focused on being reliable. Reliability reduced pressure. When people trusted my effort, they gave my English more space to grow. Policies also shape culture in quiet ways. Break times. Safety rules. Clear boundaries between roles. In American workplaces, rules are not personal. They are structural. If something is not allowed, it's not about you. It's about liability. Once I understood this, my emotional reaction softened. Before that, every correction felt like criticism. Afterward, it felt like information. This distinction matters when learning English. Emotional interpretation drains cognitive energy. When you take things personally, your brain shifts away from language and toward defense. But when you see rules as systems, not judgments, your mind stays open. I also learned how much Americans value self-direction. People don't always explain everything. They expect you to ask, but only when necessary. Asking too many questions can feel like dependence. Asking none can feel like disconnection. Finding the middle took time. I practiced short questions. Clear ones. Is this okay? Can you check? Like this. These phrases became tools. They showed engagement without slowing. the system. And each successful exchange built confidence, not loud confidence, but usable confidence. There was a moment one evening when I realized something had shifted. A task changed suddenly. Instructions came quickly. I didn't catch every word, but I understood the direction. I moved. I adjusted. And no one corrected me. That moment mattered more than perfect comprehension. It meant I was reading the culture, not just the language. Cultural learning is often invisible, but it carries language forward. Once you understand what matters, speed, clarity, effort, English stops feeling like a performance. It becomes a function. Neuroscience supports this. When expectations are clear, the brain reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty lowers stress. Lower stress improves language access. Culture, in this way, becomes a support system, not a barrier. Many learners struggle not because their English is weak, but because cultural signals confuse them. They spend energy guessing intention, instead of processing words. When you understand the rules underneath, language feels lighter. By the end of those 2 weeks, I still didn't know every rule. But I trusted myself more inside the system. I knew that effort was visible. That clarity mattered. That silence had meaning. And that mistakes were tolerated when intention was clear. If you're learning English in the US, don't rush to master expressions. Start by noticing reactions, timing, pace. What moves things forward? Culture teaches you how to use language before language teaches you what to say. Because once you feel the rules, English doesn't feel like a test anymore. It feels like participation, imperfect, human, and allowed. Love under exhaustion. People talk about love as if it exists in perfect conditions. Calm evenings. Deep conversations. Soft music in the background. But real love, especially when you're living in a new country and working 2 jobs, shows up in a very different form. It shows up when everyone is tired. During those 2 weeks, exhaustion didn't just affect my body or my English. It entered my relationship quietly. Not as conflict at first, but as distance. Short answers. Longer silences. Misunderstood tones. Love didn't disappear, it simply had less energy to express itself. When both people are tired, communication changes. Words shrink. Patience thins. And when English is not your first language, that shift becomes even more dangerous. You're not just translating thoughts. You're translating emotions, and emotions don't like to wait. There were evenings when we sat in the same room, but lived in different worlds. My mind was still. At work, replaying instructions, unfinished sentences, moments where my English failed me. My partner wanted connection. I wanted quiet. Neither of us was wrong. But we were misaligned. This is where language matters in a different way. Not public English. Not workplace English. But emotional English. The kind you use to say how you feel when you don't have the energy to explain everything. I noticed that on days when I was too tired to speak much, my partner filled the silence with assumptions. Silence, without context, invites interpretation. An interpretation under stress often turns negative. This isn't about blame. It's about the brain. Psychology shows that when people are exhausted, they rely more on emotional shortcuts. Tone feels sharper. Neutral words feel cold. When a second language is involved, misunderstandings multiply. You may say less to avoid mistakes, but that silence can sound like withdrawal. I learned this the hard way. One night, after a long day, my partner asked a simple question. I answered briefly, efficiently, like I would at work. But love doesn't run on efficiency. It runs on reassurance. My answer was correct in English, but wrong in meaning. That night, we didn't argue loudly. We argued quietly, through disappointment. And quiet disappointment lasts longer. The next day, something changed. Not magically. Intentionally. I realized I needed fewer words, but clearer ones. Not long explanations. Just emotional signals. Short sentences that carried intention. I'm tired, not upset. I need quiet, not distance. Today was hard for me. These sentences were simple. Grammatically easy. But emotionally powerful. They gave context. And context prevents damage. Neuroscience explains why this works. The brain seeks safety before connection. When you name your state, you reduce uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty lowers emotional threat. Once threat drops, empathy becomes possible again. I also noticed something important. When I practiced English only as a tool for work, it felt heavy. But when I used English inside my relationship, gently, imperfectly, it softened. English stopped being a test. It became a bridge. We started doing something small together. At the end of the day, each of us shared one sentence about how the day felt. Not what happened. Just how it felt. Sometimes in English. Sometimes mixed. Sometimes with gestures filling the gaps. One sentence sounds insignificant. But it created rhythm. And rhythm is what exhaustion destroys. First, there were still hard days. Days when we misunderstood each other. Days when love felt thin. But something important stayed intact. Effort was visible. Not effort to be perfect. Effort to stay connected. In American culture, I noticed that emotional directness is often valued. Not dramatic emotion, but clarity. Saying, I'm overwhelmed, is not weakness. It's information. And information allows adjustment. This was new for me. In many cultures, love means enduring silently. Here, love seemed to mean naming limits. Once I accepted that, pressure eased. I didn't need to perform strength. I needed to communicate state. Working 2 jobs didn't make our relationship romantic. It made it honest. We learned which conversations required energy we didn't have, and which only required presence. Sitting together without talking became acceptable. Silence, when explained, became safe again. English played a strange role in this. Sometimes, speaking in a second language actually reduced emotional overload. Simpler words prevented overthinking. Short sentences prevented spirals. English, in its simplicity, protected us from saying too much when too much could hurt. By the end of those 2 weeks, love didn't look grand. It looked practical. A shared meal eaten quietly. A check-in sentence. A hand on the shoulder instead of a long conversation. And I realized something important. Love under exhaustion doesn't disappear. It changes shape. It becomes smaller, but stronger. Less expressive, but more intentional. If you're learning English while balancing work, marriage, and survival, remember this. You don't need perfect language to protect love. You need clear signals. Short truths. Gentle honesty. Because when effort is respected inside a relationship, language stops being a barrier. It becomes just another way of saying, I'm still here. People talk about love as if it exists in perfect conditions. Calm evenings. Deep conversations. Soft music in the background. But real love, especially when you're living in a new country and working 2 jobs, shows up in a very different form. It shows up when everyone is tired. It shows up at 6 in the morning, when the alarm rings too early and neither of us wants to move. I lie still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to your breathing beside me. You turn slightly, half asleep, and your hand reaches out until it finds mine. No words. Just a quiet reminder that I am not alone in this. Our apartment is small. Too small, some would say. The heater makes strange noises, and the kitchen light flickers if we turn on the microwave at the same time. But this place has learned our routines. It knows the sound of our footsteps, the way we rush in and out, the way we collapse onto the couch at night without even turning on the TV. You leave first. Your job starts earlier than mine. I watch you put on your jacket, your movements slow, careful, like you're trying not to wake the world. At the door, you pause. You always do. You look back. Smile a tired smile and say, we'll be okay. Some mornings, I believe it immediately. Other mornings, I have to repeat it to myself all day. By the time I leave for my first job, the streets are already busy. People walk fast here. Everyone seems to know exactly where they're going. I still feel like a guest in this country, like someone who arrived late to a party where all the rules were already written. I listen more than I speak. I count my words before I use them. At work, I smile. I answer questions. I move quickly. There is no space for my worries here. No one asks how tired I am or how heavy my thoughts feel. They just want things done. And I do them, because rent does not wait, and dreams are expensive. During my break, I check my phone. Sometimes there's a message from you. Just a short one. Busy today. Or miss you. Those two words can change everything. They remind me why I'm here, why I keep going when my body wants to stop. The second job is harder. My legs ache. My head feels full. I make small mistakes and apologize more than I should. When I finally clock out, the sky is already dark. I walk home slowly, letting the cold air wake me up just enough to make it through the door. You're usually there before me. When I open the door, I smell food. Simple food. Nothing fancy. Whatever we could afford that week. You look up from the stove and smile, the same tired smile from the morning, but warmer now. Like you've been saving it for me. We eat quietly most nights. Not because we're angry. Not because we don't care. We're just exhausted. Our conversations are short. How was work? Okay. You? Long, but in between those words, there's understanding. We don't need to explain everything. We already know. After dinner, we sit together on the couch. Sometimes you rest your head on my shoulder. Sometimes I put my feet on your lap. The TV plays something neither of us is really watching. Our bodies are here, together. Even when our minds are still catching up. There are moments when the pressure feels too heavy. When bills pile up. When homesickness hits without warning. When I wonder if we made a mistake by coming here, by choosing this life. In those moments, love does not look like a movie scene. It looks like you handing me a cup of tea without asking. It looks like silence that feels safe instead of awkward. One night, I finally say it out loud. I'm scared, I whisper. My voice is small. I'm afraid if I speak louder, everything will break. You don't fix it. You don't give advice. You just take my hand and hold it tighter. Me too, you say. And somehow, that makes it easier to breathe. We go to bed early, even though we know the morning will come too soon. As we lie there, I think about the people who imagine love as something easy. Something smooth. Something that only happens when life is calm. I wonder if they would recognize this version of love if they saw it. This love is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It works quietly in the background, like a steady heartbeat. It survives on small gestures, and shared exhaustion. It grows stronger not because things are perfect, but because we choose each other when things are not. Before I fall asleep, you turn toward me. We're still here, you say softly. It's not a question. It's a fact. And in that moment, I understand something important. Love is not about having energy left over. It's about giving what you have, even when you feel empty. Especially then. When effort finally speaks. People talk about love as if it only exists in perfect conditions. Calm evenings. Long talks. Soft music playing somewhere in the background. But real love, especially when you are living in a new country and working 2 jobs, shows up in a very different way. It shows up when everyone is tired. That was the season we were in. Not tired like after a bad night's sleep. Tired like your body keeps moving, but your mind feels slow. Tired like your heart wants rest, but life keeps asking for more effort. If you have ever worked 2 jobs, you understand this kind of tired. You wake up before the sun. You come home after dark. You eat quickly. You talk less. You tell yourself, this is temporary, but deep down, you're not always sure. In those days, my life felt like a long hallway with no windows. Work. Commute. Work again. Repeat. I spoke English all day, but most of it was automatic. Simple sentences. Polite smiles. Yes, sir. No problem. My mouth moved, but my heart stayed quiet. At home, things were not broken. But they were stretched thin. We still cared. We still tried. But everything felt compressed. Like love had to fit into the small spaces left over after survival. One night, after a long shift, I stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee I didn't even want. The house was quiet. Too quiet. You were already asleep. I should have been grateful for that peace. Instead, I felt heavy. I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for weeks. Is effort enough? We work hard. We sacrifice. We show up every day. But does effort always lead to understanding? To respect? To connection? This question matters more than people admit, especially in America. In this country, effort is praised loudly. Hustle culture. Long hours. Side jobs. Extra shifts. People say, respect the grind. But no one really talks about the cost. The emotional cost. The relational cost. No one tells you what happens when effort becomes the only language you speak. I started noticing small changes in myself. I interrupted more. I listened less. I answered questions quickly, not carefully. My English was improving, but my patience was shrinking. You noticed it too. One evening, you asked, "Are you still here with me?" or are you just passing through? That question landed hard. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to explain how tired I was. How much pressure I felt. How everything I was doing was for us. But something stopped me. Because effort without presence is just movement. And movement alone doesn't build closeness. That night, I lay awake thinking about the difference between working hard and being emotionally available. In psychology, there's a simple idea. When people are under constant stress, the brain shifts into survival mode. In that mode, empathy drops. Creativity drops. Even language processing becomes more rigid. That explained a lot. It wasn't that I didn't care. My nervous system was exhausted. And when two exhausted people love each other, misunderstandings grow quietly. The next day, at my first job, I watched people rush around me. Everyone looked busy. Everyone looked important. I realized something uncomfortable. America respects visible effort. But it rarely teaches you how to respect invisible effort. The effort of staying kind when you're tired. The effort of listening when you want to escape. The effort of choosing connection when distance feels easier. That realization followed me all week. I began to slow my English on purpose. Not just for learning, but for feeling. Shorter sentences. Softer tone. More pauses. Instead of saying, I'm fine, I practiced saying, I'm tired. But I'm here. Instead of rushing conversations, I practiced silence. Something changed. Not dramatically. Not instantly. But steadily. One evening, you sat next to me and said, you feel different. Lately. Different how? I asked. More present, you said. Like you're not running inside your head all the time. That sentence mattered more to me than any compliment at work. Because respect, I realized, is not built only by effort. It is built by awareness. By choosing how you show up, even when no one is watching. Working 2 jobs taught me discipline. But almost losing connection taught me wisdom. That was the beginning of a shift. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't show up on social media. The kind that happens internally first. If you are listening to this and you feel tired in your bones, I want you to know something important. Your effort is real. Your exhaustion makes sense. But love does not survive on effort alone. It survives on small choices made repeatedly. In the next part of this story, everything doesn't suddenly become easy. But something becomes clearer. We begin to choose differently. We begin to protect what matters, even when life keeps demanding more. And that choice changes everything. Choosing us on purpose. Change rarely arrives with fireworks. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, like a small adjustment in how you breathe. You don't wake up One morning feeling completely different. You just realize, one day, that you are no longer drowning in the same way. That's how it happened for us. After admitting that effort alone was not enough, we didn't suddenly quit our jobs or move to a better place. Life didn't pause to reward our honesty. Bills still came. Schedules stayed tight. Alarm clocks remained cruel. But something inside us shifted. We stopped waiting for someday to save us. Instead, we started choosing each other on purpose. It began with very small things. Almost embarrassingly small. I started coming home and sitting down before speaking. Just 1 minute. Letting my body land in the room. Letting my mind catch up with my presence. In psychology, this is called a transition ritual. It helps your nervous system understand that one role has ended and another has begun. I didn't know the term back then. I just knew it helped. You noticed it too. You don't bring work home as much anymore. You said one night. I still bring it, I replied. I just don't let it speak first. That became our quiet rule. We also changed how we talked. When you were tired, I stopped trying to fix things. When I was overwhelmed, you stopped minimizing it. We replaced fast solutions with slower listening. Instead of saying, "It's fine," we practiced saying, "This is hard." Those words did something powerful. They made space. We chose one evening a week to protect. No extra shifts. No overtime guilt. No phones on the table. At first, it felt irresponsible. Like we were breaking an unspoken rule of survival. But that evening became our anchor. Sometimes we cooked. Sometimes we just sat on the floor and talked. Sometimes we didn't talk much at all. We learned that silence, when chosen together, feels different from silence caused by exhaustion. My English improved during that time, not because I studied harder, but because I used it more honestly. I spoke slower. I searched for words that felt true, not just correct. That's something language learning rarely teaches you. Accuracy matters. But authenticity changes everything. I started realizing how much climate, culture, and policy shape emotional life in America. Long winters that keep people indoors. Work policies that reward productivity more than presence. A culture that praises independence but quietly punishes vulnerability. Living here taught me resilience. But loving here taught me intention. One night, during our protected evening, you asked me a question that surprised me. Do you think effort should always be respected? You asked. I thought about it carefully. I think effort should be seen, I said slowly. But respect grows when effort is paired with care. You nodded. That's what I've been feeling. That conversation stayed with me. Because effort without care can feel cold. And care without effort can feel unstable. Love needs both. Over time, our home felt warmer. Not because life got easier, but because tension stopped filling every space. We laughed more easily. We forgave faster. We rested without explaining ourselves. I noticed something else too. When I stopped pushing myself past my limits emotionally, my motivation to learn English actually improved. My brain felt safer, more open. Neuroscience shows that learning happens best when stress is manageable, not overwhelming. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was integrating. Working 2 jobs had taught me discipline. Choosing balance taught me sustainability. There was one evening that made everything clear. We were walking home after dinner. The air was cool. The street lights reflected softly on the sidewalk. Nothing special happened. No big conversation. No dramatic moment. You reached for my hand. And I realized how long it had been since that felt effortless. In that moment, I understood something deeply. Love doesn't ask you to stop trying. It asks you to try wisely. It asks you to notice when effort turns into avoidance. When productivity replaces presence. When doing this for us becomes a way to avoid being with us. If you're listening to this and you feel stuck between responsibility and connection, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need perfect conditions to choose love. You need awareness. You need courage. You need small, repeated choices. Working 2 jobs changed me. But choosing us changed how I worked, how I loved, and how I learned. In the next and final part of this story, I'll share what happened when these choices began to shape our future in ways we never expected. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But meaningfully. And maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize parts of your own story too. Respect looks different now. Respect used to mean something very simple to me. It meant waking up early. It meant working late. It meant never complaining, even when your body begged you to stop. I believed that if I worked hard enough, people would understand. If I showed enough effort, respect would arrive automatically, like a reward at the end of a long day. But living in America, working 2 jobs, and loving someone through exhaustion slowly changed that belief. Respect, I learned, is quieter than effort. It doesn't clap. It doesn't announce itself. Sometimes, it doesn't even look impressive from the outside. It shows up in how you listen. By this point in our story, our life looked mostly the same on paper. Same apartment. Same city. Same weather that changed moods faster than forecasts could predict. Summers that drained you. Winters that made you miss sunlight like a friend. But inside, things felt different. I noticed it first. In the mornings, I no longer jumped out of bed already tense. I still felt tired, but it wasn't heavy in my chest anymore. My thoughts felt slower, kinder. I spoke to myself differently. Instead of thinking, "You're behind," I started thinking, "You're doing your best today." That small change mattered more than I expected. At work, I stopped apologizing for existing. I still worked hard, but I stopped shrinking myself emotionally. When I didn't understand something, I asked. When I needed a moment, I took it. My English reflected that shift. I spoke with fewer filler words, fewer nervous laughs. I paused without panic. I let silence breathe. People responded differently, not dramatically, but with more patience. Respect, I realized, is not demanded. It is invited. At home, respect looked even simpler. It looked like asking, "Do you want advice, or do you want comfort?" It looked like saying, "I hear you," and meaning it. It looked like noticing when the other person was close to their limit, and stopping before pushing further. One night, after dinner, you leaned back and said, "You know what feels different now?" I waited. "I don't feel like I have to earn rest anymore." That sentence stayed with me. Because for a long time, rest felt like a reward we hadn't earned yet. Something we would deserve later. When things were stable. When we were successful enough. When life allowed it. But life never really allows it. You have to choose it. In American culture, effort is often visible, but rest is hidden. People respect long hours more than emotional regulation. They admire exhaustion disguised as ambition. I had fallen into that trap. But love pulled me out. Not by force. By example. I watched how you rested without guilt. How you protected small joys. How you said no without explaining yourself endlessly. That taught me something effort never could. Balance is not laziness. Boundaries are not weakness. Care is not optional. There was a moment, a very small one, that confirmed this change. We were sitting on the couch, doing nothing special. The TV was on. But neither of us was really watching. I reached for my phone out of habit, then stopped. Instead, I stayed. You noticed. You smiled, just slightly. That smile felt like respect. Not for my work. Not for my sacrifice. But for my presence. I realized then that effort had shaped my survival, but awareness was shaping my future. And that mattered deeply, especially as someone learning a language, a culture, and a new way of loving at the same time. Language is not just vocabulary. It's timing. It's tone. It's knowing when not to speak. My English became slower, but richer. My listening became more important than my speaking. I learned that understanding is often built in pauses, not sentences. If you're learning English and living through stress, this matters. Your brain learns best when it feels safe. Your heart connects best when it feels seen. Respect grows in those conditions. Working 2 jobs changed how I viewed effort. Loving through exhaustion changed how I viewed respect. Now, when I think about success, it's not just about income or progress. It's about sustainability. About being able to look at the person beside you and still recognize yourself. That's a quiet kind of success. But it lasts. In the final part of this story, I'll share how all of this, effort, love, language, and choice, came together in a way I never expected. Not as a perfect ending, but as a meaningful one. One that finally felt like home. What stayed when everything settled? There is a moment in every long struggle when nothing dramatic happens, but you suddenly realize you are no longer the same person who started. That moment came to me quietly. Not on a payday. Not after a promotion. Not after quitting one of the jobs. It came on an ordinary morning. The alarm rang, as usual. The light outside was soft. The weather was neither kind nor cruel, just neutral, like many American mornings. I sat on the edge of the bed, feet on the floor, and noticed something surprising. I was calm. Still tired, yes. Still busy. Still living a life that required effort. But the tight knot in my chest was gone. The constant inner pressure had softened into something manageable. I realized then that working 2 jobs had changed my schedule. But everything else had changed me. The way I spoke. The way I listened. The way I loved. The way I respected effort, my own and others. In the beginning, I thought effort meant proving something. Proving worth. Proving seriousness. Proving that I deserved to be here, in this country, in this life, in this relationship. But effort, I learned, is not a performance. It's a commitment. And commitment looks different when it matures. It stops yelling. It stops rushing. It starts choosing carefully. By this point, our life looked steady from the outside. Not glamorous. Not impressive. Just stable. And for the first time, stability didn't feel boring. It felt safe. We still worked hard. But we worked smarter. We protected rest without apology. We protected each other without drama. We stopped turning every conversation into a problem-solving session. Sometimes, love just needed space to breathe. I noticed how much this affected my English. I no longer tried to sound perfect. I tried to sound present. I spoke with fewer words, but more intention. I listened without planning my reply. I let silence exist without filling it out. Of fear. That's something no textbook teaches you. Language becomes powerful when you stop using it to defend yourself. Living in the US taught me many practical things, systems, policies, responsibilities. But it also taught me something deeper about climate and culture. In many places here, life moves fast. Time is expensive. Effort is visible. But emotional labor is often invisible. You are expected to handle stress quietly, professionally, efficiently. What I learned is this: if you don't slow down intentionally, life will speed past your values without asking. Working 2 jobs forced me to confront that truth early. And love forced me to respond to it honestly. There was one evening that felt like a closing circle. We were sitting together after dinner. No rush. No plans. Just the low hum of the house and the sound of distant traffic. You leaned your head on my shoulder. You feel settled, you said. I thought about it. I feel aligned, I answered. That word mattered. Because alignment is what happens when your actions match your priorities. I was no longer chasing respect through exhaustion. I was earning trust through consistency. I was no longer measuring love by how much pain we could endure together, but by how well we could protect peace. That is a different kind of strength. If you are listening to this while learning English, while struggling, while working too much, while loving through uncertainty, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need perfect pronunciation to be understood. You don't need perfect conditions to be respected. You don't need perfect timing to choose connection. You need awareness. You need honesty. You need small, repeatable choices. Working 2 jobs changed me because it stripped life down to essentials. And what stayed, what truly stayed, was love that adapted, effort that matured, and a voice that finally sounded like my own. This story didn't end with everything solved. It ended with everything aligned. And sometimes, that's the happiest ending of all. Working 2 jobs didn't just change my schedule. It changed the way I listen, the way I speak, the way I love. And maybe, if you're still here right now, it's changing something in you too. Because this story isn't really about me. It's about effort that goes unseen. About love tested by exhaustion. And about learning English not from textbooks, but from real-life moments when you're tired, scared, and still choosing to stay. If you're learning English and you feel slow, stuck, or discouraged, remember this. Progress doesn't always sound confident. Sometimes it sounds quiet. Sometimes it sounds like you, showing up again tomorrow. And if this story made you pause, even for a second, imagine what the next one might unlock. On this channel, we don't rush English. We don't chase perfection. We learn real English through real stories, real emotions, and real life in America. So if you want to improve listening, reading, speaking English naturally, understand American culture, work life, love, and family, and learn English in a way that feels human, slow, and sustainable, subscribe to the channel now. Like the video to support more real stories. Comment below, do you respect effort? I read every comment. The next story is already waiting. And it might sound a lot like your own. See you in the next video.